Hello. Welcome to Twisted Stories, where intriguing and unexpected stories come to life. Please support the channel by following and sharing. The silence inside the Gilded Serpent, the most exclusive underground restaurant in New York, where only the city's most dangerous men dined, was absolute. A fork clattering onto a plate would have sounded like a gunshot. Everyone was staring at Table 1, the table that belonged to Kean Thorne, the most ruthless mafia boss on the East Coast. The man whose single nod could make anyone disappear forever. His 7-year-old daughter was screaming, a high-pitched, terrifying sound that had paralyzed the entire staff. Nannies had quit. Psychologists had failed. 17 of them in 5 years. And his stunning fiancée, Vivian Ashford, was currently trying to drag the child away by her arm, her manicured nails digging into the little girl's flesh. Then a waitress stepped forward. A woman with worn canvas shoes, a burn stain on her apron, and eyes that carried the darkness of someone who had seen too much suffering. She did not yell. She did not beg. She didn't bow to the mafia king like everyone else. She did one single thing that made the most feared man in New York freeze in his tracks and changed everything. But no one knew that this waitress was hiding a secret. A secret connected to Kean Thorne's empire. A secret that could either destroy them all or save them. If you loved this story of dark romance, revenge, and redemption, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs a good story. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what happens next. But before we learn what that waitress did, we need to turn back the clock a few hours earlier to understand who Cassandra Mora was and why her eyes carried such deep shadows. A shift at the Gilded Serpent was a carefully choreographed dance between anxiety and deadly risk. For Cass, it was just another ordinary night of dodging rough hands, balancing scorching plates of expensive fish, and pretending not to hear the contemptuous remarks of the city's elite. She adjusted her apron, hiding its frayed edges. She needed this shift. Mr. Novak, her landlord, had made it clear that if the rent wasn't paid before Friday, she and her brother would be thrown out onto the street. Cassandra Morrow wasn't born to live like this. 18 years earlier, when she was only 10, her life had been entirely different. Her father, Thomas Morrow, was an honest police officer, one of the few who refused to bow to the underworld. One winter night, he turned down a massive bribe from a mafia gang. 3 days later, his body was found in a dark alley, 3 bullets through his chest. Cass still remembered her mother's scream when the police knocked on their door. She still remembered how her mother collapsed on the floor, clutching her father's coat and refusing to let go for 3 days. 3 months after the funeral, her mother died of a heart attack. The doctor said it was poor health, but Cass knew the truth. Her mother died of a broken heart because she couldn't live in a world without her husband. And just like that, at the age of 10, Cassandra became an orphan, dragging along her 1-year-old brother Theo into Street Matthews orphanage. The years there were a living hell. Cass had to protect Theo from bigger children who wanted to bully him, from drunken caretakers who liked to teach lessons with leather belts. She once had 2 ribs broken for hiding bread for her brother. She was once locked in a dark basement for 3 days for daring to talk back, but she never cried in front of them. She learned to swallow her tears, learned to read people, learned how to survive in a world that didn't want her to exist. Now at 28, Cass thought she had escaped hell. But fate struck again. Theo, the brother she had spent her life protecting, was diagnosed with a severe congenital heart disease. He needed a surgery that cost $250,000. No insurance would cover it. No miracle appeared. Cass had worked like an animal for 8 years, holding 3 jobs at once, waitressing by day, washing dishes by night, and cleaning hospitals on weekends. She had saved $80,000, penny by penny, drop of sweat by drop of sweat. Then 6 months earlier, the man she thought she would marry, the man she had given her heart and trust to, vanished with all that money. He left only a scrap of paper on the pillow with a scrawled line. "Sorry, baby. Business is business." Cass didn't cry when she read it. She had forgotten how to cry long ago. She simply crushed it in her hand, threw it in the trash, and went to her night shift as usual. But inside, another part of her had died. That morning, before going to the Gilded Serpent, Cass visited Theo at the hospital. He lay there thin and pale, still forcing a smile when he saw her. "Are you close to having enough money yet?" Theo asked weakly. "Almost there," Cass lied, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Just a little more." She didn't tell him that the doctor had called her into the hallway and said they couldn't wait any longer. She didn't say that without the money. Within a month, Theo's heart would stop beating. She only held his hand tightly, promised to come back tomorrow, then walked out of the hospital with the weight of the world on her shoulders. And now she stood here in a restaurant beneath the city where killers and criminals dined in worn shoes and a scorched apron, watching a 7-year-old child screaming in pain that no one understood. She saw the beautiful woman clawing her nails into the child's tender skin. She saw the most powerful man in the room standing helplessly, not knowing how to save his daughter. And something inside Cass ignited. 18 years of protecting, Theo had taught her one thing: act first, fear later. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about losing her job. She only thought about the child in pain, and she knew exactly what to do. Cass took a heavy linen napkin from a nearby service station. She didn't ask anyone for permission. She didn't look at anyone. She walked straight to the lighting control panel near the kitchen door and dimmed the entire area to half brightness. The harsh glare softened instantly, as if someone had drawn a thin veil across the room. A few guests looked up in irritation, but no one dared to speak. In this world, curiosity could get you killed. Then Cass walked directly to table 1. "Move away," Vivienne hissed, her green eyes flashing like a snake's. "We don't need a waitress." Cass ignored her. She even ignored the gaze of Kieran Thorne, the man whose single wrong look could make her disappear forever. She knelt on the restaurant floor right beside the screaming, thrashing child. She didn't touch Maisie. She didn't speak to her. She simply took the linen napkin and draped it over her own head, forming a small white tent. Then she sat there in silence, legs crossed as if meditating in the middle of a storm. The entire restaurant held its breath. No one understood what she was doing. Vivienne's mouth fell open, too shocked to react. Kieran Thorne stood like a statue, his grey eyes fixed on the strange scene before him. And then the miracle happened. Maisie's screaming faltered. She stopped thrashing. Her wide eyes, still full of tears, but no longer panicked, stared at the strange woman sitting beneath a white cloth. The oddness of the image broke the terrifying spiral in her mind. Maisie's brain was no longer trapped in noise and light. It was trying to understand something new. Slowly, Cass lifted one corner of the cloth and looked out. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. Then she let the cloth fall, disappearing back into her small tent. Maisie blinked. The room was quieter now. The lights were dimmer. The frightening woman with the sharp nails was farther away. And there was a stranger sitting on the floor, safe inside a small tent. Not threatening, not shouting, not trying to drag her anywhere, Maisie crawled forward. Little by little, like a small cat exploring new territory. Kieran Thorne, the man who had seen blood spilled, who had heard begging, who had given the cruelest orders, was now holding his breath as he watched his daughter crawl toward a waitress. Maisie stopped before the cloth tent. Her small hand trembled as she lifted a corner. Cass looked at her. Their eyes met, and in a whisper only Maisie could hear, Cass said, "Sometimes the world is too loud, isn't it? It's okay. Everyone is allowed to hide." Maisie's lower lip trembled. She nodded. A tiny movement carrying an entire world of trust. "I have a secret base," Cass whispered, opening the cloth wider. "In here, there's no noise." Maisie crawled inside. The entire restaurant watched as the daughter of the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast crawled under a napkin with a stranger waitress. 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. 2 people, the daughter of the mafia king and the poorest waitress in the city, sat curled together beneath a white linen cloth on the floor of the most luxurious underworld restaurant in New York. The screaming had stopped completely. There was only Maisie's gentle breathing and the pounding of Cass's heart. Inside the tent, Maisie looked at Cass with eyes still wet but calm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Cass slowly lowered the cloth, revealing Maisie sitting peacefully beside her, breathing evenly, her hands no longer trembling. Cass stood, brushed off her worn apron, and looked straight into Kieran Thorne's eyes. She didn't bow her head. She didn't tremble. She spoke calmly, even as her heart pounded like a war drum. "She has sensory processing disorder." The crashing sound overloaded her auditory system. Grabbing her made her feel like her skin was burning. She just needed to reset. Then she turned to Vivian. The beautiful woman stood there with her face flushed red with anger and humiliation. Her nails still bore traces of Maisie's tender skin. Cass looked straight into her eyes and said coldly, "And never grab a panicking child. That teaches them that safety is something they have to fight for." Without waiting for response, Cass turned and walked toward the kitchen. Her back was straight. Her steps were steady. She didn't look back. The silence stretched for another 5 seconds. Then, from somewhere in the restaurant, came the sound of applause. Just one person, then two. The brief applause was cut short by Vivian's icy glare. But the damage was already done. Before the most powerful figures in New York's underworld, a waitress in torn shoes had done what dozens of highly trained experts couldn't, and the balance of power at table 1 had changed forever. Kieran Thorne couldn't take his eyes off his daughter. Normally, after a meltdown like that, Maisie would become catatonic for days. She would refuse to eat, refuse to speak, refuse to let anyone touch her. The doctors called it a recovery phase. Kieran called it hell. Watching his daughter like a breathing corpse while being unable to do anything. But tonight, Maisie was eating pasta. She was carefully twirling each strand with her fork, lifting it to her mouth, chewing slowly. She even pointed at a painting on the wall and whispered something to the worn cloth doll she always carried. This was a miracle. There was no other word for it. In 5 years, 17 nannies, 9 psychologists, and countless experts with diplomas longer than his arm, none of them had achieved this, and a waitress in torn shoes had done it in 30 seconds with a napkin. Kieran glanced at Vivian. She was furiously tapping on her phone, clearly trying to control the story before it spread. Her perfect face was now twisted with rage and humiliation. The control she had always prided herself on had been shattered by an anonymous waitress in front of everyone. Kieran said nothing to Vivienne. He called Pritchard, the restaurant manager, who was trembling in the corner like a mouse waiting for a cat's paw. "Who is that waitress?" Kieran asked, his voice low and slow like distant thunder. Pritchard swallowed. "Just a temporary staff member, sir. Cassandra Morrow. She's only been here 3 months. I sincerely apologize for her disrespect. I'll fire her immediately for daring to speak to your guest like that." Kieran tilted his head toward Pritchard. A small movement, but enough to drain the color from the man's face. "If you fire her," Kieran said slowly, each word dropping like a stone, "I'll buy this building, then I'll throw you onto the street before sunrise. And you know I'm not joking." Pritchard nearly collapsed to his knees. Yes, sir. I understand completely. Bring her to the VIP room in the back after we finish eating." Pritchard nodded repeatedly like a puppet on strings and hurried away. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. Vivian tried to speak several times, but Kieran didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, on the kitchen door where the waitress had disappeared, on the eyes that hadn't flinched when they met his. On the way, she spoke to Maisie as if the child were a normal human being. Not a problem to be solved. 45 minutes later, Kieran sat alone in the VIP room. Vivienne had taken Maisie home, and he knew she was seething inside. He didn't care. He had more important matters. The door opened. Cassandra Morrow walked in. She didn't bow her head. She didn't cower. She stood straight, shoulders squared, looking directly at him, as if he were just an ordinary customer in an ordinary cafe. "Sit down," Kieran ordered, pointing to the chair opposite. Cass sat, her hands rested on her thighs, not fidgeting, not twisting. She waited. "Do you know who I am?" Kieran asked. "I do. And you still dare to look me in the eye. Would you prefer I look elsewhere?" Kieran almost laughed. Almost. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him like that. "What do you know about sensory processing disorder?" he asked instead of answering her question enough to recognize it when I see it. "From where?" Cass was silent for a second. "My brother. When he was young, he had similar symptoms. I learned how to handle it." "How is your brother now?" "He's in the hospital. Heart disease." Kieran nodded slowly, filing the information away. "You aren't afraid of me?" It wasn't a question, but a statement. Cass met his steel-grey eyes. "I've seen things more frightening than you, Mr. Thorne." Then she paused as if realizing what she had said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "It's true," Kieran interrupted, his voice carrying something he himself didn't recognize. "Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps respect. You're the first person in 5 years to look me in the eye without trembling." Cass said nothing. She simply sat there waiting as if she had all the time in the world while sitting across from the most notorious killer on the East Coast. Kieran studied her for a moment longer. The worn canvas shoes, the scorched apron, the eyes carrying the shadows of someone who had seen too much suffering. But there was no weakness in them, only survival, only resilience. "I have a proposal for you," Kieran said at last. "But not tonight. You'll be contacted." Cass stood. "May I go now?" "You may." She turned toward the door, but before opening it, she stopped. "Your daughter," Cass said without turning back. "She isn't broken. She just experiences the world differently. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Then she walked out, leaving Kieran Thorne alone in the VIP room, feeling for the first time in many years a faint glimmer of light in the darkness he had lived in for far too long. 3 days after the meeting at the Gilded Serpent, Kieran Thorne sat in his office at Thorne Tower, the skyscraper he owned in the heart of Manhattan. From the 63rd floor, he could see the entire city spread beneath him like a giant chessboard. But today, he wasn't looking out the window. He was looking at the thick file on his desk. Declan Byrne, Kieran's most loyal right hand, stood across from him. This was the man who had followed Kieran since the earliest days of building the empire, who had killed for him, nearly died for him, and was one of the few people Kieran truly trusted. "This is everything we found on her boss," Declan said in a low, steady voice. Kieran opened the file. The first page was a photograph of Cassandra Morrow. Not a bland employee photo, but a candid shot of her walking out of a hospital. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, yet her steps still steady. He began to read. With each page, he turned. His face grew colder, but not with anger, with something he had thought he no longer had the capacity to feel. Father Thomas Morrow, police officer, killed when Cassandra was 10. The case officially remained unsolved, classified as a cold case. But Kieran knew the truth. He knew exactly who was behind that murder. Salvatore Vega. The name made Kieran clench his jaw. Vega was his greatest rival in the underworld. The venomous snake who had tried many times to overthrow the Thorne Empire. And 18 years earlier, Vega had ordered the killing of an honest cop for refusing a bribe. That cop was Cassandra's father. Karen kept reading. Mother Sarah Morrow died of a heart attack 3 months after her husband's death. Childhood Street Matthews Orphanage. Records noted multiple incidents of violence without detail. Medical files showed Cassandra Morrow had been hospitalized 3 times in 7 years there for various injuries. Broken ribs, severe bruising, minor head trauma. Kieran had seen many terrible things in his life. He had done many terrible things. But reading about a 10-year-old orphan beaten in an orphanage, he felt a cold fury rise in his chest. Present. 3 jobs, 2 months behind on rent, bank account nearly empty after being defrauded of $80,000 by a man named Marcus Webb, who had now disappeared from the city. Karen memorized the name. Marcus Webb wouldn't stay gone for long. Then he turned to Theo Morrow's section. Brother, 19, second-year computer engineering student at Columbia University, full scholarship. Grade point average 3.9. Congenital heart disease. Urgent surgery required. Cost $250,000. Currently treated at Brooklyn General. Condition worsening daily. And on the last page, there was a photograph. Cassandra sat beside Theo's hospital bed. She was holding her brother's hand, wearing a small smile, though her eyes were ringing dark from lack of sleep. The brother was thin and pale. Yet looking at her with absolute trust, Kieran stared at the photo for a long time. He thought of Maisie, of the way his daughter had looked at the strange waitress with that same trusting gaze, of the miracle that had happened in 30 short seconds. "She's clean, boss," Declan said. "No ties to any organization, no criminal record, no hidden motives, just a girl who's lived a very hard life and is still trying to stand." Kieran closed the file. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering city below. Cassandra Morrow had lost her father to the underworld. She had grown up in violence and pain. She had every reason to hate men like him. Yet she walked into the Gilded Serpent every day, serving powerful men she surely despised, just to earn enough to save her brother. Pure survival, Kieran respected that. "Arrange a meeting," he said without turning to Declan. "Bring her here. I have an offer she can't refuse." 2 days later, Cassandra Morrow stood in the lobby of Thorne Tower, trying not to gape like a country girl in the city for the first time. She had received a call from an unknown number the night before. A low and cold male voice saying only one sentence. "Mr. Thorne wants to see you. A car will pick you up at 10 tomorrow morning." Then hanging up. There was no choice, no refusal. And now she was standing here inside the skyscraper, she had only ever seen in magazines, where even the chandelier in the lobby was worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. A man in a black suit escorted her into a private elevator all the way up to the 63rd floor. When the doors opened, Cass stepped into the penthouse and had to struggle to keep the shock off her face. The apartment was larger than the entire building she lived in. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked all of Manhattan. The furnishings were minimalist, yet every piece radiated unimaginable wealth. An abstract painting on the wall was probably worth more than Theo's surgery. Kieran Thorne stood by the window with his back to her. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing a strong forearm with a long scar running from wrist to elbow. When he turned, his grey eyes studied her, as if she were a contract to be analyzed. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the black leather sofa opposite him. Cass sat back straight, hands on her thighs. She didn't lower her gaze. "I'll go straight to the point," Kieran said, sitting across from her. "I have an offer for you. Listen to everything before you decide." Cass nodded and waited. "My daughter Maisie needs someone who understands her. In 5 years, I've hired 17 nannies. All of them ran away. 9 psychologists with diplomas longer than my arm. None of them did what you did in 30 seconds at the restaurant." She said nothing, only listened. "I want to hire you as a living nanny for Maisie. Salary $20,000 a month. All living expenses covered. You'll have your own room, your own car, and anything you need." Cass felt as if someone had punched her in the chest. $20,000 a month, more than 10 times what she earned from 3 jobs combined. But she knew there was no free lunch, especially from a mafia boss. "And what's the condition?" she asked directly. Kieran looked at her, something flickering in his eyes. Perhaps respect for her not being naive. "I'll pay the full cost of your brother's surgery. $250,000. Transferred to the hospital tomorrow if you agree." Cass felt the world stop. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. $250,000. Theo's life given to her as if it was spare change. "Why?" she asked hoarsely. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Why do all this?" "Because in 5 years, no one has looked at my daughter as a normal child. They all saw her as a problem to be solved, something broken to be fixed. You were the first person to sit on the floor with her and say it was okay to hide." Kieran stood and walked to the window. "I'm not a good man, Cassandra. I've done things that would disgust you if you knew, but for Maisie, I'm willing to pay any price." Cass looked at his back, trying to process everything. "But that's not all," she said. "You said there were conditions." Kieran turned back. And for the first time, Cass saw something like hesitation on his face. "My world," he said slowly, "requires appearances. My council, old men who believe power needs a stable family. They want me to marry Vivian Ashford to strengthen an alliance, but I don't trust her. There have been signs that make me suspicious." Cass waited. "I need time to investigate Vivian, and to do that without raising suspicion. I need a reason not to marry her." He looked straight into Cass's eyes. "Before the council, before the outside world, you'll be my wife." "What?" Cass jumped to her feet. "A marriage on paper. Nothing real. You'll have your own room, your own life. I won't touch you if you don't want me to. But in public, you're Mrs. Thorne." "You're insane," Cass said, stepping back. "I can't pretend to be the wife of a mafia boss. I don't belong to this world." 6 months, Kieran said. "Just 6 months. After that, if you want to leave, I'll give you enough money to start a new life anywhere. $1 million plus your accumulated salary. You and your brother will never have to worry about money again." Cass paced the room. This was madness. Complete madness. She couldn't agree to this. Her father was killed by the mafia. She had sworn never to be involved with that world. Then she thought of Theo. Of the way he looked at her every day with hope. Of the doctor saying they couldn't wait any longer. Of the steady beeping of the heart monitor in the hospital room, a reminder that time was running out. "What if someone finds out the truth?" she asked weakly. "I'll protect you," Kieran said, stepping closer. "No one is allowed to harm what's mine, and when you sign this contract, you become mine." Cass looked into those steel grey eyes. She thought of her father, who died for refusing to bow to this world. She thought of her mother who died because she couldn't survive the pain. She thought of Theo, waiting for a miracle she couldn't create alone. Sometimes to save the ones we love, we must step into hell. All right, Cass said, her voice steadier than she expected. I agree. 3 days after signing the contract, Cassandra Mororo moved into Thorn Tower with a small suitcase that contained everything she owned. The suitcase looked pathetic, sitting in a bedroom 3 times larger than her old apartment. Her room was in the east wing of the penthouse with glass windows overlooking the Hudson River, a private bathroom with a marble bathtub larger than her old bed, and a walk-in closet completely empty, waiting to be filled. Cass opened the suitcase, looked at the worn clothes she had brought, and let out a dry laugh. She could fit all her belongings into the smallest drawer of this closet and still have space left. A maid knocked on the door, introduced herself as Helena, and asked if she needed anything. Cass didn't know how to answer. She had never had a maid. She had never stayed in a room where the sink had gold-plated faucets. She had never seen a bed with thousand thread-count Egyptian silk sheets. She thanked Helena and said she didn't need anything. Then closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed trying to breathe normally. She was here now. In the lion's den, there was no turning back. That afternoon, Declan gave her a tour of the penthouse. The apartment had 12 rooms, including a private gym, a miniature cinema, a library with thousands of books, and a rooftop garden with an infinity pool overlooking all of Manhattan. Maisie's room was in the west wing, separated from Cass's by a long corridor. Declan stopped before a white door painted with hand-drawn flowers. She's in there, he said carefully. She doesn't like strangers. She doesn't like noise. She doesn't like being touched. Most of the time, she pretends no one exists. Cass nodded. I know the boss has very high expectations of you. Declan looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Don't disappoint him. Then he left and Cass stood alone before the white door. She took a deep breath and gently opened it. Maisie's room was designed like a small fairy tale world. Pastel blue walls with hand-painted white clouds, a castle-shaped bed with sheer curtains, shelves filled with picture books and dolls. But Maisie wasn't on the bed or in a chair. She was curled in the darkest corner of the room, clutching her old cloth doll, staring into empty space. Cass said nothing. She didn't greet her. She didn't try to come closer. She simply went to the opposite corner of the room about 4 m away, sat on the floor, and took out a ball of yarn and 2 knitting needles from her bag. Then she began to knit. The first stitch, the second stitch, the third stitch. The soft click of the needles sounded like rain on a thatched roof. Cass didn't look at Maisie. She didn't expect a reaction. She just sat there knitting as if this were the most normal thing in the world. 18 years of caring for Theo had taught her something important. Wounded children don't need someone to rush into their lives with promises and warm embraces. They've been betrayed too many times to trust that. They need someone patient enough to wait, wise enough not to force, steady enough to prove they won't disappear. So Cass didn't speak to Maisie on the first day. She just sat knitting in the corner from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 6 o'clock in the evening until a servant came to call Maisie to dinner. The girl stood, still not looking at Cass, and walked out as if she didn't exist. Cass wasn't discouraged. She knew this was a long battle, and she had survived hell. She could wait. On the second day, Cass returned, sat in the same corner, and continued knitting where she had left off. Maisie still didn't look at her. The third day was the same. On the fourth day, Cass noticed Maisie had moved a little closer, only about half a meter, but enough for her to know the strategy was working. On the fifth day, Cass deliberately dropped the ball of yarn. It rolled slowly across the floor and stopped right at Maisie's feet. The girl looked at the yarn, then at Cass, then at the yarn again. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes. Then Maisie bent down, picked up the yarn, and brought it to Cass. Thank you, Cass said softly, still not looking directly into Maisie's eyes. Would you like to learn to knit? Maisie didn't answer, but she sat down beside Cass. And that was the first step forward. The second week brought changes Cass hadn't dared to hope for. After the day, Maisie first sat beside her. The girl began appearing earlier in the playroom each afternoon. As if she were waiting for something. Cass kept the same routine. She arrived, sat in the familiar corner, took out her yarn, and began to knit. She didn't force Maisie to talk. She didn't ask if she was well, if she had slept or eaten properly like the previous nannies surely had. She was simply there, quiet and steady, like a lighthouse in the dark. On the 9th day, Maisie brought a box of colored pencils and a stack of blank paper into the playroom. She no longer sat in the dark corner. She sat about 1 meter from Cass, spread the paper on the floor, and began to draw. Cass didn't look at what Maisie was drawing. She knew direct attention could make the girl retreat like a snail into its shell. So, she kept knitting, giving Maisie space, but staying close enough for her to know she was there. They sat like that for hours. The sound of pencils brushing paper. The soft click of knitting needles. No music, no voices, just the quiet presence of two people learning to trust. On the 11th day, as Cass reached a difficult section and had to stop to undo a wrong stitch, she heard light footsteps. She looked up and saw Maisie standing in front of her, holding a sheet of paper with both hands, eyes fixed on the floor. Cass said nothing. She waited. Maisie extended the paper toward her without looking up. Cass gently took the drawing. It was a child's crayon sketch, clumsy yet heartbreakingly clear. Two stick figures stood side by side, one taller with long black hair, one smaller with curly black hair. They stood beneath a large blue umbrella. Above them, a red dragon breathed fire, but the flames couldn't reach the two beneath. The umbrella protected them. Cass felt her throat tighten. She understood exactly what the drawing meant. The dragon was the outside world, the noise, the harsh light, the grabbing hands, everything that frightened Maisie. And the umbrella was the napkin tent. Safety, the place where noise couldn't reach. Who is this? Cass asked gently, pointing to the two figures, though she already knew. Maisie was silent for a long time. Then, in a voice so small, Cass had to lean forward to hear. She said, "Me," pointing to the smaller figure and sister. Moving her finger to the taller one. Cass felt as if a knife had pierced her heart in the best possible way. This was the first time Maisie had called her by a name. Not waitress, not nanny. "Sister, I really like this drawing," Cass said softly, her voice trembling despite herself. "May I keep it?" Maisie nodded slightly, then returned to her place and kept drawing. This time, she sat closer. So close their shoulders nearly touched. Cass knew she had crossed a wall no one had breached in 5 years. She didn't know someone was standing at the door watching. Kieran Thorne had come home earlier than usual, intending to go to his office, but stopped as he passed Maisie's playroom. He stood silently, watching through the half-open door. He saw his daughter, who hadn't spoken to anyone but her doll for 2 years, handing a drawing to a stranger. He heard the word sister from lips that hadn't spoken to the living in a very long time. And something in his chest, something he thought had died long ago with Elena, began to stir. From that day on, Kieran Thorne began coming home earlier. He no longer stayed at the office until midnight. He no longer ate alone in his study. Instead, he returned at 6 o'clock in the evening at dinner time and sat at the table with Maisie and Cass. At first, no one spoke much. Karen didn't know what to say to his daughter. Maisie wasn't used to her father's presence at meals. But Cass was there, a silent bridge, and the tension slowly eased. One evening, as they were eating, Maisie suddenly pointed at the window and said to Kieran, "I see a bird." 3 words, just 3 words. But to Kieran Thorne, they meant more than any business report, more than any victory in the underworld. His daughter had spoken to him. And when he looked up and met Cass's eyes across the table, he saw her smiling. A small, discreet smile. As if she understood exactly what this moment meant, Kieran Thorne, the cold and ruthless mafia boss, felt his heart beat 1 step faster. The news spread like wildfire. Kieran Thorne, the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, had secretly married an unknown waitress just 2 weeks after breaking off his engagement to Vivian Ashford. Tabloids published blurry photos of Cass entering Thorne Tower. Social media exploded with rumors and speculation. People said she had seduced the boss. People said she was pregnant. People said everything without knowing the truth. And in a luxurious penthouse on the Upper East Side, Vivian Ashford was smashing a $50,000 set of Chinese porcelain. "That waitress," she screamed, hurling an antique vase at the wall. The crash was deafening. "He chose a waitress instead of me." Rhett Calloway, the tall man in a black suit standing motionless in the corner, didn't flinch at her rage. He was used to her fits. He knew she wasn't truly furious about being rejected. She was furious because a 3-year plan had collapsed. "Calm down, Tessa," Rhett said, using her real name. Vivian Ashford turned, green eyes flashing dangerously. But she didn't object to being called by her true name, because in this room there was no need for masks. Vivian Ashford had never existed. She was a character created 10 years earlier with flawless forged documents, a fabricated family history, and a noble Boston background no one bothered to verify. The woman standing here was Tessa Brennan, a professional con artist who had seduced and ruined 5 wealthy men before Kieran. She didn't work alone. She worked for Salvatore Vega, Kieran Thorne's sworn enemy. The plan was simple. Tessa would marry Kieran, gain his trust, then extract internal information so Vega could destroy the Thorne empire from within. Kieran's death would be the final stage. After all assets were transferred to Tessa, but a waitress in torn shoes had ruined everything in one night. The plan doesn't change, Rhett said calmly. Vega still wants Thorne dead. We just adjust the approach. Tessa stopped amid the shattered porcelain, breathing hard, but her mind began working again. She wasn't foolish. She hadn't survived this world by letting emotion rule her. That waitress, Tessa said coldly. Find out everything about her. Find her weakness. Find anything we can use. Rhett nodded. He had already begun investigating yesterday. 2 weeks later, Cass received notice that she must attend a charity gala as Mrs. Thorne. Kieran hired a stylist to come to the penthouse with dozens of expensive gowns for her to choose from. Cass stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection in an elegant black dress worth more than 5 months of her old salary. She didn't recognize herself. At the gala, Cass felt like a fish thrown into a tank of sharks. Women glittering with jewels looked at her with disdain, hidden behind polite smiles. Men in expensive suits studied her with curiosity and suspicion. She was an intruder. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. Kieran stayed by her side all evening, one hand lightly at her back, a silent but protective presence. But at times he had to greet partners, leaving Cass alone by the champagne table. That was when Vivian appeared. She approached from behind, tight red dress, golden hair, a smile sweet as honey, laced with poison. Ah, the new Mrs. Thorne, Vivienne said softly, each word like a blade. Or should I call you Cassandra, little waitress? Cass didn't step back. She had faced far more frightening things than a beautiful woman with a false smile. You can call me Cass. We don't need to pretend to be friendly. Vivian tilted her head, green eyes sharp. Interesting. You know you're playing with fire. Kieran Thorne's world isn't for fragile girls who carry plates. I've survived things you can't imagine. Miss Ashford. Cass replied calmly. Don't worry about me. Vivienne stepped closer. Close enough for her breath to brush Cass's ear. I know about your brother, she whispered. Theo, right? At Brooklyn General. Surgery scheduled. It would be a shame if something happened before that day. Cass went rigid. Her blood turned to ice. If you dare touch Theo. Oh, I don't need to do anything. Vivian laughed lightly, stepping back and sipping champagne. I just want you to know you don't belong here. Sooner or later, Kieran will realize that. And when he does, you'll lose everything. Not just this fake marriage, but everything you're trying to protect. Then she turned away, melting into the crowd as if the conversation had never happened. Leaving Cass alone with her heart racing and hands trembling with anger. Beneath the fear, another fire was burning. Suspicion. Something wasn't right about Vivian Ashford. The way she spoke, the way she knew about Theo, the way she looked at Cass like a pawn on a chessboard. And Cass decided she would find the truth no matter the cost. After the charity gala, Cass couldn't sleep. She lay on the soft silk bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, thinking about Vivian's threat, about Theo, about everything she could lose. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, she gave up trying to sleep and went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. She didn't expect Kieran to be there. He was sitting alone at the bar, a glass of whiskey before him, gazing through the glass wall at the city at night. Glittering like a million fallen stars. He wasn't wearing a suit as usual, just a black shirt, sleeves rolled up, collar open. He looked tired, and for the first time, he looked like an ordinary man instead of a mafia boss. Can't sleep? Kieran asked without turning around, as if he had known she was there. Cass hesitated for a second, then walked over and sat one stool away. No. And you? I don't sleep much. Haven't for a long time. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people too exhausted to keep their masks on. Kieran poured another whiskey and slid it toward Cass. She took a small sip, feeling the warmth burn down her throat. What did Vivienne say to you at the gala? Kieran asked suddenly. Cass wasn't surprised he knew. He had eyes and ears everywhere. She threatened Theo. She knows my brother is in the hospital. Kieran's jaw tightened. I'll handle it. I know you will, Cass said. But I want to know who she really is. Something about her isn't right. Don't you feel it? Kieran was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. I've suspected it for a long time, but I don't have solid proof. They sat there sipping whiskey in silence until Kieran suddenly said, Elena didn't like alcohol. Cass looked at him, surprised he mentioned his late wife. No one in this house dared speak that name. She liked chamomile tea, Kieran continued. Grey eyes fixed on nothing. Every night she made a pot, sat by the window, and read. She said it was how she ended a day. Peaceful, quiet. He paused, swallowing. She died giving birth to Maisie. Postpartum complications. The doctor said they did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. His voice grew heavier, more painful. I was with her the whole time. I held her hand when she took her last breath. And the last thing she told me was to take care of our daughter. He let out a bitter laugh. Look how well I did. My daughter didn't speak to me for 2 years. She was afraid of me. Afraid of everyone. Cass didn't know what to say. She just listened because sometimes that is all someone needs. And you? Kieran asked, turning to her. What have you survived? Cass looked down at the whiskey in her hand. She had never told anyone about the orphanage years. Not out of shame, but because no one ever asked. No one cared. Street Matthews Orphanage, she began softly, as if speaking about someone else. I was there from 10 to 17. The older kids liked to bully Theo because he was small and weak. I fought a lot to protect him. She pushed up her sleeve, revealing a faint scar on her forearm. The supervisor liked to use a belt. I took most of the beatings instead of Theo. Once I was locked in the basement for 3 days for hiding bread. Kieran looked at the scar, then into her eyes. In those cold grey eyes, Cass saw something she hadn't expected. Understanding, respect, and a flash of anger, not toward her, but toward those who had heard her. Before Kieran could speak, a scream came from Maisie's room. They both rushed there. Maisie was sitting on her bed, eyes wide, screaming in a nightmare. Cass didn't hesitate. She took the linen napkin she always kept in her nightclothes pocket, sat beside the bed, and began building the tent. Tent time, she whispered. Maisie slowly calmed, crawled under the familiar cloth tent, curling beside Cass. Kieran stood at the door, unsure what to do. Come in, Cass said gently, opening the tent wider. There's room for 3, Kieran hesitated. The most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, a man who had killed without blinking, who made a city tremble, stood there unsure whether to crawl under a napkin with his daughter and his fake wife. Then he sat on the floor and joined them. 3 people huddled beneath the cloth tent. Maisie in the middle, head on Cass's shoulder, hand holding Kieran's finger. Darkness surrounded them, but it was safe darkness. This is the strangest thing I've ever done, Kieran whispered. You'll get used to it, Cass replied with a small smile. Silence lingered. Then Kieran said softly. I don't think I'll ever get used to you, Cassandra. And in the darkness of the napkin tent, Cass's heart beat 1 step faster. After that night, everything began to change. Cass no longer saw Kieran as a terrifying mafia boss. She saw a man who had lost his wife and didn't know how to love his daughter. She saw a father who was trying awkwardly and imperfectly, but trying all the same. But she didn't allow herself to dwell on it. She had another mission to focus on. Vivian Ashford. In the following weeks, Cass began noticing small details she had previously overlooked. She noticed the way Vivian spoke Spanish on the phone when she thought no one was listening. She noticed the way the woman looked at Kieran, not with love or even desire, but with cold calculation, like a snake waiting for its prey to lower its guard. She noticed the seemingly accidental meetings between Vivian and Rhett Calloway. The bodyguard Kieran had hired 3 years earlier, they always stood too close. They always whispered things Cass couldn't hear. And every time she caught their eyes, she felt a chill run down her spine. She began keeping notes, dates, times, locations, conversations she overheard by chance, suspicious behavior. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. But the survival instinct sharpened by 18 years of suffering told her something was very wrong. Then one night, everything became clear. Cass woke at 2 o'clock in the morning, thirsty. She went downstairs for water. But as she passed the corridor leading to Kieran's office, she saw light spilling through a half-open door. Kieran was on a business trip in Chicago. He wouldn't return until morning. So, who was in his office at 2 o'clock in the morning. Cass held her breath, pressed herself against the wall, and looked through the gap. Rhett Calloway was standing at Kieran's desk, a phone in his hand, photographing each document page by page. He moved quickly and professionally, as if he had done this many times before. Each page was turned, photographed, and replaced exactly as it had been. No trace left behind. Cass withdrew silently, heart pounding like a war drum. She returned to her room, locked the door, and sat on the bed, trembling. She had been right. There was a spy in the house, and if Rhett was the spy, then who was he working for? The answer flashed in her mind like lightning. Vivian. The next morning, as soon as Kieran returned home, Cass asked to speak privately. They went into the library, which Kieran had checked to ensure there were no listening devices. Cass told him everything. Her suspicions about Vivian, the secret meetings between Vivian and Rhett, and most importantly, what she had seen the night before in his office. When she finished, Kieran's face showed nothing. But Cass saw his jaw tighten and his fingers curl into fists. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I saw it with my own eyes," Cass replied. He photographed at least 20 pages. Kieran stood, walked to the window, his back to her, silence stretched. Cass knew he was processing, planning, deciding who would have to die. "I want to kill him right now," Kieran said coldly. "But if you do that, we won't know who he's working for," Cass said. "And we won't know who Vivian really is." Kieran turned to her in his grey eyes with surprise and respect. "You think like a strategist." "I've survived hell," Cass replied. "You learn a few things along the way." Kieran nodded slowly. "Then what do you suggest?" "Pretend we know nothing. Let Rhett continue to think he's safe. Meanwhile, have Declan investigate Vivian thoroughly. Find out where she came from, what she was doing before she entered your life, and who she's working for." Kieran studied her for a long moment. Then one corner of his mouth lifted, almost a smile. "You know, Cassandra, when I hired you, I didn't expect you to become a strategic advisor." "Life is full of surprises," Cass said. And just like that, they became allies in a war where the enemy was still hidden in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 2 weeks after the conversation in the library, Declan brought news Kieran had suspected, but that still made his jaw clench when he heard it. They sat in Kieran's private office with the door closed, and Declan placed a thin file on the desk, suspiciously thin. "Vivian Ashford didn't exist before 10 years ago," Declan said firmly. "No birth certificate, no education records, no medical history, no trace of her before 2015. All her documents from university degree to passport are Heil forgeries, the kind only a major organization could produce." Kieran looked at the file. Inside were only a few pages confirming that the woman he had nearly married was a ghost. "So, who is she really?" Kieran asked. "Unknown," Declan replied. "But I traced Rhett's contacts. He sent the photos from your office to a disposable phone registered in Vega's territory." The name chilled the room. Silverto Vega, the enemy Kieran had fought for 10 years. The man who killed Cassandra's father. And now it seemed Vega had planted a snake in Kieran's house for 3 years without him knowing. "Continue investigating," Kieran ordered. "I want her real name. I want to know what she did before she appeared, and I want to know exactly what Vega is planning." Declan nodded and left. Neither of them knew the enemy had realized they were closing in. That afternoon, Cass took Maisie to Central Park. It was the first time the girl had agreed to go outside since Cass moved in. A small step, but an important one. Maisie even held Cass's hand as they walked beneath the trees. 2 bodyguards followed at a safe distance, close enough to protect, but far enough not to upset Maisie. They stopped on a stone bench near the pond. Maisie sat and watched the ducks swim. And for the first time, Cass saw her smile. Not a big smile, just a slight curve at the corner of her lips. But it was real. "I like the blue duck," Maisie said softly. "I do too," Cass replied, her heart warm. They sat another 10 minutes, savoring the rare peace. Then Cass checked her watch and said, "We should go back, Maisie. Dad will worry." They stood and walked toward the park exit, the bodyguards behind them. Everything seemed normal until they stepped into the street to cross the small road to where the car was parked. Cass heard the engine roar before she saw it. A black car without plates raced toward them at insane speed. Cass's survival instinct reacted before her mind could process it. She grabbed Maisie, pulled her tight against her chest, and lunged sideways. They hit the sidewalk just as the car blasted past less than half a meter away. The force of the wind slapping Cass's hair, screeching brakes, shouts. The bodyguards ran with guns drawn, but the car vanished into traffic. Cass lay on the pavement holding Maisie, trembling. The girl was crying silently, tears on her cheeks without screaming. A painful sign of progress. Maisie had learned to endure fear without collapsing. "It's okay," Cass whispered, though she was terrified herself. "I'm here. You're safe." One guard called Kian. The other scanned for more threats. On the cold pavement, Cass realized the brutal truth. This wasn't an accident. It was a warning. Someone knew they were investigating. Someone wanted them to know Cass and Maisie could be touched at any time. Someone wanted them afraid. 20 minutes later, Kieran stormed into the penthouse living room like a hurricane. He saw Cass and Maisie on the sofa wrapped in a blanket, and his face changed. He knelt before them, checked Maisie head to toe. Then Cass. "Are you hurt?" he asked hoarsely. "Just a scraped knee." Cass said. "Maisie is fine." Kieran closed his eyes for a second, as if restraining something inside. When he opened them, Cass saw something she had never seen in those steel-grey eyes. Fear, not for himself, but for them. "From now on," Kieran said coldly. "You and Maisie don't leave Thorn Tower unless I'm with you. This isn't a request. It's an order." Cass wanted to argue, to say she wasn't someone who needed protection, but looking at his eyes and the way he held her hand, as if afraid she would vanish, she only nodded. The war had begun and the enemy had struck first. The days after the attack passed in a tense atmosphere. Thorn Tower became a fortress with the number of bodyguards tripled and every entrance monitored 24/7, and Cass, whether she liked it or not, was confined within luxurious glass walls. She didn't complain. She understood why. But the feeling of being trapped still made her breathless, reminding her of the days locked in the dark basement of the orphanage. Maisie seemed to sense the change. She clung to Cass more, refused to sleep alone, and every night asked for the napkin tent. Cass never refused. She understood that fear. She was afraid, too. A week after the attack, close to midnight, there was a soft knock on Cass's door. She opened it to find Kieran standing there, still in his work shirt with his tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled, as if he had run a hand through it many times. "Haven't you slept?" he asked quietly. "Not yet," Cass answered honestly. "I haven't been sleeping well these past nights." Kieran nodded as if he had expected that. "May I come in?" Cass hesitated for a second, then stepped aside. Kieran entered and looked around her room. It was the first time he had been inside since she moved in. His gaze stopped at Maisie's drawing framed on the wall. The picture of two figures under an umbrella shielding them from a dragon. "You framed it," he said, his voice carrying something Cass couldn't read. "It was the first gift Maisie ever gave me," Cass replied. "It's important." Kieran turned to her in the dim light. His grey eyes were no longer cold like steel. They were softer, warmer, filled with emotions he didn't seem to know how to handle. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Truly, I'm fine," Cass said, though her voice trembled more than she wanted. "It's just that I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if I'd reacted 1 second slower. If Maisie," she didn't finish. "She didn't need to." Kieran stepped closer. He reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. His hand was warm and rough, calloused by years of violence. Yet his grip was unexpectedly gentle. "You saved my daughter," Kieran said hoarsely. "You used your own body to shield her. Do you know what that means to me?" Cass looked up into his eyes. In that moment, every wall between them seemed to fall. The bedroom door suddenly opened. Maisie stood there clutching her cloth doll, eyes red from a nightmare. "Mommy," she called softly. Both Cass and Kieran froze. "Mommy." Maisie had just called Cass. "Mommy." Not sister, not nanny, but mommy. Cass felt as if she'd been punched in the chest. She released Kieran's hand, knelt, and opened her arms. Maisie ran to her, wrapping her arms around Cass's neck, as if afraid she might disappear. "I dreamed about the car," Maisie whispered. "I was scared you were hurt." "I'm here," Cass said, the word coming naturally before she could stop it. "I'm fine. You're safe." She carried Maisie back to bed. They made the napkin tent. Maisie curled beside Cass and fell asleep within 10 minutes. When Cass returned to her room, Kieran was still there waiting. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not the gaze of a mafia boss, not the gaze of a fake husband, but the gaze of a man looking at the woman he wanted. You know, Kieran said quietly. For the first time in 7 years, Maisie called someone mommy. Cass stepped back until her shoulders touched the wall. Kieran, you changed everything, he continued. You walked into our lives with a napkin and changed everything, and I don't know what to do with that. He stood before her, close enough for her to feel his breath. Close enough to see the small scars on his face she had never noticed before. Kieran, Cass whispered, not knowing what she meant to say. He bent down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had restrained himself too long, been lonely too long, lost too much, and feared losing more. His lips were hot and demanding, yet strangely desperate and vulnerable. Cass returned the kiss in a moment of weakness, letting herself feel wanted, needed, seen. Then reason returned like cold water. She pressed lightly against his chest and stepped back. This is just a contract, she said shakily. You pay me. I can't. We can't. Is that how you want to see it? Kieran asked, his eyes still burning. It's how it should be seen, Cass replied, though her heart screamed otherwise. You're a mafia boss. My father was killed by the mafia. This is madness. Kieran looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, stepped back, and left without another word. Cass stood alone in the darkness, lips still warm from his kiss, wondering whether she had done the right thing, or made the greatest mistake of her life. 2 weeks after that kiss, everything between Cass and Kieran became tense and awkward. They avoided being alone together. They avoided holding each other's gaze for too long. Yet every accidental brush of hands, every glance that met across the dinner table made the air heavy with unspoken things. Cass kept telling herself this was right. Keep distance. Remember, this is only a contract, but her heart wouldn't listen. Then Vivian struck. The annual Mafia Council Gala was held at a grand estate in Long Island. It was the most important event of the year where the bosses met, negotiated, and displayed power. And as Kieran Thorne's wife, Cass was required to attend. She wore a deep blue gown chosen by the stylist. Her hair in an elegant updo, and a diamond necklace Kieran had placed on her dressing table without a word. She looked like a high society lady. Yet inside she was still the orphan girl in torn shoes, trying not to collapse. The evening went smoothly for the first 2 hours. Cass stood beside Kieran, offering polite smiles, nodding to unfamiliar faces, forcing herself not to show fear. Then Vivian appeared on the small stage at the end of the room, champagne in hand, smiling brightly like a snake about to strike. Excuse me for interrupting this wonderful evening, Vivian said, her voice echoing through the microphone. But I have important information to share with everyone. About Kieran Thorne's new wife. Cass froze. Kieran stepped forward, but Vivian was faster. Do you know where Cassandra Mororo lived before moving into Thorne Tower? Vivian asked sweetly, her voice like poisoned honey. She lived in an apartment owned by Harold Novak. And who is Harold Novak? Oh, just one of Salvatore Vega's most loyal men. Murmurs spread across the room. Suspicious eyes turned toward Cass. She felt as if she were drowning in a sea of hostile faces. She lived in that apartment for 5 years. Vivian continued dramatically. 5 years under Vega's surveillance. And suddenly she appears at the Gilded Serpent, approaches Kieran's daughter, gains his trust, and becomes his wife within weeks. Don't you find that too coincidental? Vivian turned and stared straight at Cass, green eyes cold as ice. You are a spy, Cassandra Mororo. You were planted by Vega to destroy Kieran Thorne from within. And I have proof. She raised a folder and threw it to the floor at Cass's feet. Paper scattered. Photos of Cass's old apartment. Records on Novak. Logs of Novak reporting to Vega. That's not true, Cass cried, her voice breaking in desperation. I don't know who Novak is. I just rented his apartment. I know nothing about Vega. But no one listened. The room was filled with suspicion and contempt. Even Declan watched her cautiously, his hand already resting on his gun. Cass turned to Kieran, searching for trust, for someone to stand with her. He stood there expressionless, grey eyes unreadable. In that moment, Cass felt her heart shatter. Karen, she whispered. He didn't answer. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned to Declan. Find Novak. Bring him to the basement now. Then he walked away, leaving Cass alone amid whispers and pointing fingers. She had never felt so alone. 3 hours later, in the basement of Thorne Tower, Harold Novak knelt on the cold concrete, blood running from his nose and mouth. Kieran stood before him, sleeves rolled up, specks of blood on his forearms. Declan watched silently from the corner. "I'll ask one last time," Kieran said coldly. "Did she know?" Novak coughed blood, trembling. "No, she knew nothing. I swear. Vega ordered me to monitor her since she left the orphanage. I only had to report on her life, make sure she didn't leave the city. She never knew." "Why did Vega care about her?" Kieran demanded. Novak hesitated. Kieran punched him. "Why?" "Because of her father." Novak screamed. "Thomas Mororo. He was the cop who gathered evidence against Vega 18 years ago. Vega killed him, but never found the evidence. He thought Mororo might have hidden it somewhere. And his daughter might know, so he's watched her all her life, waiting to see if she'd lead him to it." Kieran went still. Cass had been watched for 18 years without knowing. Her life wasn't fate. It was a chessboard she never knew she was on. "She's innocent," Kieran said. Not a question, but a declaration. "Innocent?" Novak nodded frantically. "She's just a girl trying to survive. She knows nothing about Vega, about me, about any of this." Kieran turned and left the basement. He had to find Cass. He had to tell her he believed her. He had to hold her and say everything would be all right. But when he reached her room, the door was open and the room was empty. Cass was curled in the corner of Maisie's room, holding the sleeping child, silent tears on her cheeks. He entered and knelt before her. "I know the truth now," Kieran said gently. "You're innocent. You're a victim. Your whole life you've been a victim." Cass looked up, eyes red. "My whole life," she whispered brokenly. "My whole life has been a lie. I thought I was free, but I never was." Kieran took her hand and held it tightly. "I'll burn Vega's world to the ground for you. I swear." After that night, Kieran became almost obsessively protective of Cass. He doubled the security around her, refused to let her go anywhere alone, and spent far more time at home than at the office. But there was one meeting he couldn't avoid. The Council of Bosses demanded an emergency session in Chicago to discuss Vivian's accusations and decide the future of the alliance. If Kieran didn't appear, they'd treat it as an admission of guilt. He had to go. On the morning of his departure, Kieran stood at Maisie's door, watching Cass read to her. Cass looked up and met his gaze and saw the deep worry in his grey eyes. "I'll be back as soon as I can," Kieran said. "Declan will stay with you and Maisie. Don't leave the penthouse for any reason." Cass nodded. "We'll be fine." Kieran hesitated, then stepped forward and kissed Maisie's forehead. The little girl smiled and wrapped her arms around his neck. Then he looked at Cass and for a moment she thought he might kiss her too. Instead, he only squeezed her shoulder gently and walked away. She watched until the elevator doors closed, a heavy unease pressing on her chest for no clear reason. That evening passed normally. Cass fed Maisie, read to her, and built the towel tent as usual. Maisie fell asleep at 8, still clutching her cloth doll. Cass sat beside her bed for a while, listening to her steady breathing, then returned to her own room. She didn't know those were the last peaceful minutes before the storm. At 10 p.m., Thorn Tower's security system went dead. Lights flickered and went out. Cameras stopped. Electronic locks disengaged. All in 3 seconds. Cass was reading When Darkness Fell. She jumped from the bed. Survival instinct screaming. Something was terribly wrong. She ran toward Maisie's room, but before she reached it, the elevator doors opened. 5 men in black, faces covered, flooded into the penthouse. Behind them walked Vivian in a blood-red dress, a poisonous smile on her lips. "Good evening, Mrs. Thorne," Vivian said sweetly. "Or should I call you Cassandra, little orphan girl?" Cass backed away, eyes searching for anything to defend herself. How did we get in?" Vivian laughed. "Oh, you can thank Rhett. He's been ours from the beginning. He shut down the entire system and gave Kieran's loyal guards a long nap. Only Declan was a problem, but he's busy in the basement, locked up with a few corpses." Cass's heart seemed to stop. "Declan?" "No." 2 men lunged and grabbed her. She fought, kicked, clawed, but they were too strong. They gagged her and tied her hands behind her back. "The child," Vivian ordered, pointing to Maisie's room. "No." Cass screamed behind the gag, struggling wildly, helplessly, watching a man enter Maisie's room and drag the child out. Maisie woke in terror and began to scream, the shrill sound tearing through the dark. She kicked and scratched, but he only tightened his grip. "God, make it stop," Vivian hissed, covering her ears. "That noise is unbearable." She pulled a syringe of clear liquid from her purse and tossed it to Rhett, who stepped from the shadows with a vicious grin. "Put her to sleep. I can't stand the noise." Rhett advanced on Maisie with the syringe. Cass struggled harder, trying to scream a warning through the gag. She couldn't let them hurt Maisie. She couldn't. "Wait," Vivian said, signaling him to stop. She stepped before Cass and bent to meet her eyes with sick fascination. "You know, Cassandra, I've waited for this moment a long time. 3 years. 3 years pretending to be Kieran Thorne's devoted lover, waiting to take everything. Then you appeared and ruined it in one night with a stupid napkin." She grabbed Cass's chin, nails digging into her skin. "But it's fine. The plan only changes slightly. Instead of marrying Kieran and stealing from within, I'll use you and the girl to force him to hand over everything. Then Vega will kill him. And you." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "You'll die slowly and painfully. I'll make sure of it myself." She straightened and waved a hand. "Take them. And Rhett. If the girl won't be quiet, inject her." "I don't care." They were dragged into the elevator, down to the parking garage, and shoved into a black unmarked van. Maisie was still screaming, reaching for Cass, but they were kept apart. Cass could only look at her through tears, trying to send one message. "I'm here. You'll be safe. I'll protect you, even if I die." The van drove through the night for nearly an hour before stopping. They were dragged out and thrown into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts. Inside was cold and damp, lit by a few weak yellow bulbs. Maisie had stopped screaming from exhaustion, but she was trembling uncontrollably, eyes empty, slipping into the shut-down state Cass knew too well. "Tie the girl to the chair," Vivian ordered. "And watch the waitress. Don't let her try anything." They bound Maisie to an old wooden chair. She didn't resist, just sat like a broken doll, staring into nothing. Cass was thrown to the floor across from her, hands still tied, gag removed. Vivian sat in a chair facing them, took out her phone and dialed. "Kieran Thorne," she said when he answered, triumphant. "I have your wife and daughter. If you want to see them alive again, you know what to do." She hung up and smiled at Cass. "Now we wait. And pray that your Kieran loves you enough to give up his empire." Cass looked at Maisie's empty eyes and swore she'd get her out, no matter the cost. Time crawled like a nightmare without an ending. Cass didn't know how long they'd been trapped in the warehouse. Maybe an hour, maybe 3. She only knew she had to act before it was too late. She studied her surroundings, memorizing every detail. The warehouse looked like it had once been an old factory office. In one corner stood a large wooden table with several bottles of hard liquor and a heavy crystal ashtray. A silver Zippo lighter lay beside them. Against the opposite wall rested an old brass telescope, probably a decorative leftover from when the factory still operated. Vivian sat in the far corner on the phone, discussing transfers of money and assets. Rhett stood guard with a gun in hand, but he was distracted, glancing at his phone again and again. Only one other man remained in the room, positioned near the door. Cass looked at Maisie. The child still sat motionless on the chair, but her eyes were no longer empty. She was looking at Cass, and in that gaze was something Cass recognized. Trust. Maisie was waiting for Cass to do something, and Cass wouldn't fail her. Over the past hours, Cass had been quietly rubbing the rope, binding her hands against a sharp piece of metal on the warehouse floor. The rope had worn thin, and with one strong pull, she could free herself. But she needed the perfect moment. She glanced toward the table near Maisie and nodded slightly. Under the table, Cass had spotted a small red button. She wasn't sure what it was, but it looked like an old factory emergency alarm. If it still worked, it might trigger the fire system, or at least create enough noise to distract them. Maisie followed Cass's gaze, saw the red button, and gave a tiny nod. Almost imperceptible, she understood. Vivian ended her call and walked toward them with a triumphant smile. "Good news. Kieran has agreed to hand over control of his entire empire in exchange for you two. He's on his way." She bent toward Cass. "See, he really does love you. How pathetic. Love makes people weak." Then Vivian turned to Rhett. "Get ready. When Kieran arrives, kill him first, then kill these two. No. Cass screamed and yanked her arms. The rope snapped. She lunged for the table, grabbed a bottle, and threw it into the air above Rhett's head. He looked up instinctively, distracted for a second. That was all Cass needed. She seized the heavy crystal ashtray and hurled it with all her strength. It cut through the air with perfect accuracy and shattered the bottle midair. High-proof liquor splashed over Rhett from head to chest. Cass grabbed the Zippo, flicked it, and threw it. Flame met alcohol, and Rhett erupted like a living torch. He screamed, staggered, dropped his gun, clawed at his burning face and chest. The stench of burning flesh filled the warehouse. Now, Maisie! Cass shouted. Maisie didn't hesitate. She slid off the chair, crawled under the table, and slammed her hand onto the red button with all the strength of a 7-year-old. The alarm wailed. The fire sprinklers activated, blasting water throughout the warehouse. The guard at the door panicked and fled in the chaos. Vivienne shrieked in fury and lunged for the fallen gun. Cass charged. They collided on the soaked floor, rolling, punching, clawing. Vivienne was stronger than Cass expected, driven by madness and hatred. She grabbed Cass's hair and yanked hard, then pinned her down, hands crushing her throat. You damn waitress! Vivienne screamed, her face twisted with rage, water streaming over it. I had everything. I was going to be queen. You ruined it all. Cass couldn't breathe. She clawed at Vivienne's hands and face, but couldn't break free. Her vision blurred. Lights danced before her eyes. She was dying. Then from behind Vivienne, a small figure appeared. Maisie. The child held the heavy brass telescope with both hands. Her face was soaked with artificial rain and tears, but her eyes were harder than any 7-year-old should be. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She swung the telescope with all the strength in her small body. Clang! Metal met bone like a bell. The telescope struck the back of Vivienne's head with shocking force. Vivienne's eyes rolled back, her grip loosened. She collapsed unconscious, blood seeping from her scalp. Cass lay gasping, dragging air into her lungs like someone pulled from drowning. Every breath burned, but she was alive. She was alive. Maisie dropped the telescope. It clattered to the floor. She stared at her shaking hands, as if she couldn't believe what she'd done. Cass crawled to her and pulled her close, holding her as if she might vanish. She took out the linen napkin she always carried, the same one from the first night at the Gilded Serpent, and draped it over both of them. Time for tent, Cass whispered hoarsely. Beneath the soaked cloth, amid the screaming alarm, the smoke and stench of Rhett groaning in the corner, the unconscious body of Vivienne on the floor, Maisie pressed her head to Cass's chest and sobbed. I was so scared, Mom. I was too, Cass said through tears. But you were very brave. You saved me. They sat there together under a wet cloth, waiting for someone to come pull them out of hell. Gunshots rang out from outside the warehouse. 1 shot, 2, 3, then silence. Cass held Maisie tighter beneath the wet cloth, her heart hammering. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know if it was Vega's men or Kieran's. She only knew she had to protect Maisie at all costs. The warehouse door burst open with a thunderous crash. Cass tightened her hold, bracing for the worst. Then she heard that voice. Cass Maisie. Kieran. She lifted the edge of the cloth and saw him standing in the doorway, gun in hand, shirt stained with blood, grey eyes sweeping the chaotic room with the wild focus of a beast searching for its pack. Declan and a team of guards poured in behind him, quickly securing Rhett, as he groaned on the floor and checking the unconscious Vivienne. But Kieran didn't look at them. He looked only toward the corner where a wet cloth covered 2 huddled figures. He ran to them, dropped to his knees, and gently pulled the cloth aside. Maisie looked up at her father, eyes red, lips trembling. Dad, she whispered, then broke down and threw herself into his arms. He held her as if she would vanish if he let go. Tears streamed down his face. For the first time in many years, the cold and ruthless mafia boss was crying. Then he turned to Cass. She sat there, bruises blooming on her throat, hair soaked and tangled, face scraped and battered, but alive. Still here. Are you okay? He asked hoarsely. Cass tried to answer, but no sound came. She only nodded as tears spilled. Kieran pulled her into his arms with Maisie. The 3 of them clung together amid the wreckage, amid the screaming alarm, amid smoke, water, and blood. Cass lifted the wet cloth and draped it over all 3, making a small tent in the middle of hell. Time for tent, she whispered brokenly. Kieran laughed through tears. You're insane, he said. Do you know that? Completely insane. I told you. Cass replied with a tired smile. I've survived hell. I can survive anything. Maisie looked up, her face still wet. I hit the demon lady, she said proudly. With the long tube, Kieran glanced at Vivian, then at the brass telescope on the floor, then back at his daughter in amazement. My daughter knocked out Vivian Ashford with a telescope, he said in disbelief. You saved Mom, Maisie answered simply. Kieran looked at Cass, his grey eyes full of what he didn't need to say. Love, gratitude, and a silent promise he'd never let this happen again. It's finally over, Kieran said, holding the two most important people in his life. It's finally over. And beneath the wet cloth, amid chaos and ruin, Cass allowed herself to believe it. The underworld has no public courts, no defense lawyers, no trials that drag on for months with endless procedures. They have their own law, and that law is enforced in a dark room beneath the basement of an abandoned hotel in Brooklyn, where the Council of Bosses gathers to judge the fate of Vivian Ashford, or more precisely, Tessa Brennan. She was brought in with her hands cuffed, her face bruised from the blow Maisie's telescope had dealt her. The arrogance and cruelty had vanished from her green eyes, replaced by pure fear, as she realized there was no escape. The evidence was presented, the false identity, the connection to Vega, the kidnapping plot, the murder conspiracy. Each charge was read like a nail being driven into her coffin. Vivian tried to defend herself, tried to shift the blame, tried to bargain, but no one listened. In this world, betrayal is an unforgivable crime. The council voted. All agreed. Tessa Brennan was stripped of all assets, marked as a traitor, and expelled from the United States with a warning that if she ever returned, death would be the only thing waiting for her. They put her on a private jet and left her in Brazil with nothing but the clothes on her back. 10 months later, news reported that a woman named Tessa Brennan had been arrested in Sao Paulo for defrauding a wealthy businessman. She was sentenced to 25 years in one of Brazil's most notorious prisons. Justice, even when delayed, is still justice. Rhett Calloway was not so fortunate. The burns from that night were too severe, and he died in the hospital 3 days after his arrest. Before he could reveal anything of value, but Kieran didn't need him to talk. He already knew enough. 2 weeks after Vivian's judgment, Kieran summoned his most loyal forces. This was not a business meeting. It was a declaration of war. Salvatore Vega had played cat and mouse with Kieran for too long. He had planted a spy in Kieran's home. He had nearly killed Kieran's wife and daughter. He had killed Cassandra's father 18 years earlier. It was time to end it. The attack came on a moonless night. Kieran led, Declan at his side, and 50 armed men followed. They stormed Vega's stronghold in New Jersey. A heavily guarded mansion everyone believed was untouchable. They were wrong. The battle lasted 45 minutes. Blood was spilled. Bullets flew. Men fell. But when dawn rose, Kieran Thorne stood amid the ruins. And Salvatore Vega lay dead at his feet, 3 bullets in his chest, exactly as he had killed Thomas Mororo 18 years before. Justice Cass was not there that night. She was home with Maisie, waiting in anxious fear. When Kieran returned the next morning, his shirt stained with blood, his face bruised, but alive. She ran to him and held him, as if he might vanish. It's over, Kieran said, exhausted but relieved. Vega is dead. Your father has been avenged. Cass said nothing. She only cried, the tears she had held back for 18 years finally released. She cried for her father, for her mother, for the 10-year-old girl who lost everything in one night. And she cried because at last, after all those years, someone had cared enough to avenge them. Before they left for home that morning, Kieran handed Cass a small, weathered ledger. He quietly informed her that Marcus Webb had been located in a coastal town, and every cent of the $80,000 he stole had been recovered. The man would never be a threat to anyone again. Kieran's voice cold and final, ensuring that the last shadow of Cass's past had been erased. 1 week after the attack, Kieran summoned the council again, but this time not to judge, but to declare. I'm withdrawing from illegal operations, Kieran said, standing before the most powerful bosses on the East Coast. The Thorne Empire will shift to legitimate business. Real estate, investment, charity, no more drugs, no more weapons, no more bloodshed. The room fell silent. A few exchanged skeptical glances. One aging council member stood, his face flushed. Thorne, you can't do this. You'll weaken all of us. I can, Kieran cut in, his voice cold as steel. And I will. Those who agree may stay and cooperate. Those who don't. He looked around the room, grey eyes full of threat. May leave right now, but remember that Vega also thought he could stand against me. No one spoke. No one left. And so Kieran Thorne began to rewrite his legacy. Not with blood and guns, but with the right decisions for the people he loved. 2 months had passed since Vega's death. 2 months of peace Cass had never known in her 28 years of life. No more threats lurking in the shadows. No more enemies watching her every move. Vivian was rotting in a Brazilian prison. Vega was dead and Thorn Tower for the first time truly felt like a home, but that was exactly why Cass knew it was time to leave. She stood in her room, the small suitcase open on the bed, folding each piece of clothing one by one. She didn't take the expensive dresses Kieran had bought her. She only took what she had brought with her, her worn old clothes, the frayed linen napkin, and the first drawing Maisie had ever given her. The one with 2 stick figures under an umbrella shielding a dragon. The contract was over. In truth, it had ended long ago. 6 months had passed, double the original term, and Cass no longer had any reason to stay. The danger was gone. Kieran didn't need a fake wife to deceive the council anymore. Maisie had made enormous progress and could now be cared for by a real tutor, someone with proper credentials and training, not an orphaned girl with only a GED and survival skills. She should go. She needed to go because if she stayed one more day, she would never be able to leave. Declan said, "You called a moving service." Kieran's voice came from the doorway, making Cass flinch. She turned and saw him leaning against the frame. Grey eyes fixed on her with an expression she didn't dare to read. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, only a white shirt without a tie, sleeves rolled up. He looked tired, but also more at peace than ever, as if the weight of many years had finally been lifted. "It's time, Kieran," Cass said, trying to keep her voice steady while her heart raced. "The danger's over. You don't need a bodyguard anymore. You can hire a real tutor for Maisie. Someone qualified." Not you," Kieran cut in, stepping into the room. "Not the woman who saved my daughter in the restaurant. Not the woman who taught her to trust again. Not the woman who used her own body to shield her when a car came speeding toward us. Not the woman who fought Vivian with a bottle and an ashtray to protect her." Cass turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "I was just a transaction. You needed stability. I needed money for Theo. The contract's complete." "The contract was 6 months, Kieran said, moving closer. "You've been here almost a year." "I've stayed too long," Cass said, picking up the suitcase. "I'll go back to Queens. I'll finish my nursing degree. That's what's best for everyone." She tried to walk past him, but Kieran blocked her path. He took the suitcase from her hand and set it on the floor. "I've dismantled the old council," he said suddenly. Cass froze, surprised. "What?" "The ones who only cared about appearances. The ones who saw Maisie as a stain to be hidden. I got rid of them. I'm rebuilding everything from the ground up. Legitimate, clean, and I want to spend time on what truly matters." He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. "Maisie drew this morning." Cass took it with trembling hands. She unfolded it and saw a child's crayon drawing, clumsy but heartbreakingly clear. 3 stick figures standing together. The tallest with short black hair, a shorter one with long black hair, and the smallest with curly black hair. They stood under a large blue umbrella, and above it, instead of a fire-breathing dragon, was a bright yellow sun. Beneath the picture, in the shaky handwriting of an 8-year-old, Maisie had written a single word, family. Tears overflowed Cass's eyes. "Kieran, I can't. People will talk. They'll say I'm just a gold digger like Vivian. They'll say the waitress seduced the mafia boss." "Let them talk," Kieran said, stepping closer, lifting her face with both hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Let them talk while we live. I don't care about the world, Cass. I only care that this house was a tomb before you walked in. I only care that my daughter didn't call anyone mom for 7 years until she met you. I only care that every morning when I wake up, the first thing I want is to see you." His voice lowered, heavy with feelings he had held back for too long. "If you leave, the light will go out again, Cass. And I'm not sure I can live in the dark anymore." Cass looked into those grey eyes. Once cold and ruthless, now filled only with sincerity and longing. She thought of all the reasons she should leave, the past, the difference between them, what people would say. Then she thought of Maisie calling her mom, of the nights under their towel tent, of the safety she felt beside Kieran, of the home she had never had and that was now ready to claim her. I don't want the light to go out, she whispered. Kieran bent down and kissed her. It wasn't rushed like before. It was slow, deep, full of promise and commitment. It was the kiss of a man offering his entire heart and asking her to take it. When they parted, foreheads touching, Kieran whispered, "Don't go. Stay with me, with Maisie, with our family." Cass looked down at the drawing in her hands, 3 stick figures under an umbrella, and she knew her answer. "Okay," she breathed. "I'll stay." 5 years later, the headline on the cover of Forbes magazine read, "A New Legacy: Kieran and Cassandra Thorne Transform Autism Advocacy." Beneath it was a photograph of a family of 3 standing in front of a newly opened therapy center, radiant smiles on their faces, hands tightly clasped together. But Cass wasn't paying attention to the magazine. She was standing on the balcony of their vacation home in the Hamptons, gazing out at the blue sea, glittering under the summer sun, breathing in the cool breeze and the gentle sound of waves. Her life had completely changed over the past 5 years. She had officially married Kieran in a small ceremony, with only close family and friends. She had adopted Maisie 3 years earlier, making the bond they had built legal in the eyes of the law. And she had founded the Mororo Thorne Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting children with sensory processing disorder and other developmental conditions. The door behind her opened. A 12-year-old girl stepped out, headphones over her ears, a bright smile on her lips. Maisie had grown so much. She still had difficult days, moments when the world became too loud, and she needed to retreat into her familiar towel tent. But she had learned to live with her challenges, to turn what once felt like weakness into strength. "I got accepted into the STEM program, Mom," Maisie said, holding up the letter. "They said I have a special talent for coding." Cass beamed and pulled her daughter into a hug. "I knew you could do it. You're my little genius." "Dad's crying in the kitchen," Maisie added in her usual dry tone. "He's pretending to make pancakes, but I saw him wiping his eyes." Cass laughed and went inside. In the kitchen, Kieran stood at the stove, awkwardly flipping pancakes while trying to wipe his eyes with a dish towel. He had changed so much over 5 years, still powerful and formidable, but his coldness had been replaced by warmth, and the grey eyes, once filled with darkness, now lit up whenever he looked at his wife and daughter. At the counter, Theo was sneaking blueberries, healthy and full of life. The surgery 5 years earlier had been a complete success. And now he had graduated with a degree in software engineering, worked for a major tech company, and lived in his own apartment in Manhattan. But every weekend, he still came home. Back to family, back to the sister who had sacrificed everything so he could have this life. Karen saw Cass and smiled. A smile meant only for her. "She got in," he said thickly. "Our daughter got into the STEM program." "I know," Cass replied, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind and resting her head against his back. "I'm so proud of her." "And I'm proud of you, too." Kieran turned, lifted her chin, and kissed her softly. "I still owe you for the cashmere sweater you ruined on our first night," he said, recalling a memory from long ago. "Put it on my tab," Cass winked. Maisie walked into the kitchen, saw her parents embracing, and pretended to grimace. "Could you two stop being affectionate in front of me? I'm only 12. The whole family laughed. This was the life they had built. Not on perfection, but on understanding, not on grand promises, but on small moments of presence and care. They had learned that love isn't the loudest voice. Love is sitting together in silence under a napkin until the world feels safe again. And in the end, the waitress in worn shoes didn't just serve the mafia boss. She saved him. He saved her. And together they built a family from the ashes of the past. This is the story of how one act of kindness, a bit of courage, and a napkin changed the fate of 3 lives forever. It reminds us never to underestimate the person serving your coffee, because they might be the strongest person in the room. It teaches us that family isn't always those who share your blood, but those who are willing to stand beside you when the world becomes too loud. And most importantly, it shows us that no matter how painful the past, no matter how hard life becomes, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. If we are brave enough to open our hearts and trust. If you enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and family, please like and share this video with your loved ones. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more touching stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had a moment in life when a small act of kindness changed everything? Or has someone appeared in your life like Cass did in Kieran and Maisie's, bringing light to a place that once held only darkness? Share with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear the stories from deep within your hearts. the real experiences that touched your souls. Thank you sincerely for spending your time with us from beginning to end. We wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Remember that no matter how hard life becomes, there are people who care about you and you deserve to be loved. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.